If you want to understand what frozen solid really means, don't picture a cute snowfall. Picture a country where the cold stops being weather and starts being a force. Because in early 1955, Britain didn't just have a chilly winter. It had a winter that shut doors, erased roads, trapped trains, and cut entire communities off behind walls of snow. And what makes it hit harder is the timing. Britain was only just beginning to feel like it could breathe again. The long shadow of the Second World War still sat over daily life in the early 1950s. Tight budgets, rebuilding, shortages that had only recently eased. By 1954, food rationing finally ended, and there was this sense that the country was stepping into a normal future at last. Then winter arrived like a reminder. Normal is never guaranteed. This story isn't about one dramatic day. It's about how cold builds, quietly, steadily, until you look around and realize the country is operating on survival mode. Because the winter people remember as 1955 was really the deep freeze that took hold through January and February of that year. The numbers alone tell you it wasn't ordinary. Central England temperatures for January 1955 averaged around 2.6 degrees Celsius, and February around 1.2 degrees Celsius, cold enough, long enough, to grind the everyday into something slower and harsher. But you don't remember averages. You remember what happens when cold lasts. You remember the mornings when the air feels sharp enough to cut. You remember the way water stops behaving like water, how it becomes something that bursts pipes, locks doors and turns pavements into hazards. You remember the small routines that suddenly become work. Scraping ice, coaxing an engine to start, carrying extra layers, walking carefully because one wrong step means injury. And in 1955, the infrastructure of Britain was not the Britain of today. Many roads were narrower, more rural areas were more isolated, communication was slower, and winter equipment wasn't built for extremes. So when the cold came in with snow and wind, it didn't just inconvenience people, it separated them. The deeper the freeze went, the more Britain split into two worlds, places still connected and places that became unreachable, and nowhere showed that more brutally than Scotland. By late February, conditions in parts of northern Scotland became desperate. In the Highlands, temperatures dropped to around -25 degrees Celsius in Braemar, an extraordinary value that became legendary. Snow lay deep, and drifts in places rose to heights that sound impossible until you see photos. In some areas, drifts were reported around 30 feet high. That kind of snow doesn't just cover a road, it deletes it. And once a road is gone, everything changes. Food becomes a problem. Fuel becomes a problem. Medicine becomes a problem. A routine doctor visit becomes a mission. A delivery becomes a gamble. This is the moment when winter stops being something you put up with and becomes something you fight. And while the Highlands were freezing into isolation, the same storm system was writing another chapter farther south, one that became famous for a single image, a goods train stuck, not delayed, not slowed, stuck, locked in place by snow and ice. In the Pennines, a goods train became trapped at a place called Bleath Gill near Stainmore Summit, one of the bleakest, most exposed landscapes you could pick for a battle against winter. The train crew stayed with it, and the engine itself became part of the snowfield. Because here's a detail that feels almost symbolic. When a steam locomotive sits in extreme cold, the heat that melts snow around it can refreeze as the engine cools, turning slush into ice and freezing moving parts solid. So the rescue wasn't just about shoveling snow, it was about trying to bring a machine back to life in conditions that wanted everything to stop. Workmen fought the drifts for days. Snowplows were sent, some defeated by the sheer weight of it. Teams dug, cleared, thawed, and pushed forward in brutal wind and freezing exposure. The whole effort was so dramatic, it was documented in a short film later that year, because it captured something very specific about Britain in that moment. When winter hits hard enough, survival becomes teamwork. And it wasn't only trains. Road travel became its own story of endurance. In the same period, reports described more than 100 motorists trapped in vehicles for roughly a day. That's not traffic. That's being pinned in place by weather, waiting for help, trying to stay warm, trying to stay calm, trying not to run out of fuel. Now imagine what that means in 1955. No smartphones, no live maps, no instant updates. In many cases, you wouldn't even know exactly how long help would take. You'd just know it was cold, getting colder, and the outside world had turned white. At that point, the question becomes simple. How do you reach the people you can't reach? And this is where the winter of 1955 created one of its most powerful real-life scenes. Because when the Highlands became snowbound, Britain responded with a military relief effort. It was called Operation Snowdrop. The RAF and Royal Navy were brought in to deliver supplies to cut-off areas. Aircraft dropped fodder for livestock. Helicopters carried essentials into remote villages and farms. And yes, this part is real, and it's one of the most human details of the whole story. Helicopters were used to rescue sheep, lifting them out of deep snow, sometimes carrying about 5 at a time, getting them to shelter. That's how severe it became. Not, it's cold. Not, roads are a bit tricky. But an operation where aircraft and naval crews are flying supply runs because whole communities are essentially stranded. Think about what that does to the national mood. Because winter weather is normally local. One town is worse than another. One county gets the snow, another gets the rain. But in a winter like this, the story becomes national. Everyone knows someone affected. Everyone has a cousin up north, or a friend on a road that's blocked, or a relative who can't get deliveries. And every new report reinforces the same feeling. The country is not in control. The weather is. And the freeze was not just confined to Scotland and the Pennines. Reports from the time also describe parts of southern England being hit hard too, places like Cornwall and Devon, and also areas of East Anglia, where blizzards and drifting snow blocked roads and disrupted daily life. So you had this strange map of Britain in 1955. Highlands in emergency mode. Pennines locked in a train rescue battle. And parts of the south also dealing with conditions they weren't built to handle. Now, here's the part most historical retellings miss. The cold isn't only dramatic in the moments of crisis. It's dramatic in what it does to ordinary life. Because once snow and ice become constant, everything becomes slower. Shopping becomes planning. Work becomes travel risk. School runs become dangerous walks. Small businesses lose foot traffic. Deliveries don't show up. A missed delivery isn't just inconvenience. It can mean a household doesn't have what it needs for the week. And then there's the silent damage. Frozen pipes, burst water mains, vehicles that don't start, roof damage under heavy snow. In a country where many homes relied on solid fuel heating, the need for coal and the ability to get it mattered. Coal doesn't care what your schedule is. Coal doesn't care what you can afford. Cold is equal opportunity pressure. So yes, there were moments of beauty. There always are. Snow that makes streets look clean and quiet. A landscape that feels like a different country. Children turning frozen hills into playgrounds. But beautiful is not the same as safe. And a winter like 1955 forces you to understand the difference. Because the people who remember it don't remember snowflakes. They remember isolation. They remember the feeling of being cut off. They remember that in some places, help only arrived by air. And here's a final twist that makes the winter of 1955 even more haunting. In later decades, Britain would become famous for other freezes. 1947, 1962 to 63, 1981 to 82. Those winters entered the national mythology. But 1955 can feel like the forgotten freeze to people who only know the headlines of history. Yet the proof of how serious it was is right there in the way it gets referenced. Decades later, when Britain had a major cold snap in February 2021, The Met Office described it as the coldest February night across the UK since 23rd February 1955. That means 1955 became a benchmark, a date that modern Britain still points back to when it wants to explain what serious cold feels like. So, what was the winter of 1955 really? It was a reminder that even after a war, even after rationing ends, even after people start to believe the future will be easier, nature can still arrive and rewrite the rules. It was a winter where a country learned again that progress doesn't cancel vulnerability. And it was a winter that revealed something else too, how quickly Britain could shift from everyday life to national effort. Men digging out a train for days on an exposed summit, motorists trapped in snowdrifts, waiting through the night, helicopters lifting supplies into villages the roads couldn't reach, airdrops of animal fodder, crews rescuing livestock because farms were disappearing under snow. That's not a mild winter. That's a country being tested. And in the end, the most powerful thing about the winter of 1955 is not just how cold it got. It's what people did when the cold made the map smaller. They didn't just wait for spring. They worked for survival. They organized relief. They kept each other going. So when you hear the winter of 1955 that froze Britain solid, don't picture a postcard. Picture a nation learning the hard way that winter can be more than a season. It can be an event. And for the people who lived through it, 1955 wasn't just cold. It was the winter that proved Britain could be stopped and still find a way to move again.